All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Tai-Ran Niew. We're at Niew Vineyards in Newburgh. It is Friday, July 23rd, 2021. Tai-Ran, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
First question and biggest question, as you know, is why wine?
Okay. It was more of an evolution rather than an epiphany. I grew up in a very academic environment. I grew up in university campus, and my father was an academic, my uncles are academic. I did PhD in fluid mechanics. Would have probably worked in research institution, university. Instead, I went into investment banking, and without knowing what it is, without thinking much about it, I did it for 12 years. And I stopped in 2006. Had time on my hands and just started reading about things, and that's when I actually started reading about wine. Now, wine was a part of my life even before then, but not much more so than for most consumers. Obviously, sort of like having nice wine and good food and with good company is one of the most civilized things in life. And but it was only when I started sort of reading about it that it occurred to me that the whole breadth of subjects, associated subjects, sort of from viticulture to what goes on in the winery to the business of it, the history of it, and then sort of the philosophical aesthetics, right? So what is a good wine, right? All of that, there's a community that sort of discusses that with such passion, right? And it's just sort of endlessly fascinating. There's so much that you can sort of study and do research on, and each questions leads to more questions, right? So it's more sort of going back to school, really. I mean, this is an antidote to investment banking, right? So I had an academic background, investment banking, and now I'm back in school. And it just sort of evolved from that. I did the WSET thing, and I think when I sort of finished, when I started level 3, I wrote to Jancis Robinson, the English wine writer, and I said, I like wine, but I have no idea what to do with it. And can I, while I'm working it out, work on your website, right? Or just help an intern. And I was in London then, and she just basically said, sure, why don't you come over to my house and we'll have a chat, which is the most, I've never met her, right? And that's a sort of a consistent theme throughout this process. It's just people just so willing to help. If you're keen and you're sincere, the industry as a whole is very willing to help, which is great and refreshing. And so I went to see her. We went through the options, and I think the conclusion was I should just sort of continue down the sort of diploma, master of wine, the whole path. And at the time, she was working on a book called American Wine with a lady called Linda Murphy. And she just basically said, well, since you have to be in the US, why don't you just help her do research for the book, right? And which is basically what I did. So I did some desk research, but we also traveled in Virginia, New York State, and California. Interestingly, I'm not Oregon, which she did, I didn't. And that's when it sort of really drew me more into the industry, because we had access to winemakers that normal consumers won't have. And the highlight probably was lunch with Paul Draper at Ridge, right? Just sort of him, Linda, and me, and just sort of talking about everything about wine. So there was this sort of slow kind of evolution of just pulling me more and more into the industry, but again, without sort of a clear view of what I should do next. And then I was doing the diploma. I started doing some more practical stuff in Bordeaux, in Australia. I ended up in Tasmania, and that's sort of when it sort of clicked that maybe the thing to do is to just buy a plot of land and try and grow grapes and make wine. I mean, I think Tasmania was special. It was a very sort of pristine place, and it resonated in a way that, bizarrely enough, when I went to Bordeaux or Burgundy or Barolo or Champagne, it never sort of quite did. I mean, I loved all of those places, and obviously in California, but it was Tasmania because it was just a little bit wilder, where the wine industry was a smaller part of the place. Whereas if you go to sort of like Burgundy, I mean, that place is wine. I mean, it's wine, right? Whereas if you go to Tasmania, it's a small part of it, and it's still new, it's still pristine. And that really resonated with me, the sort of communing with nature part of it. And that's sort of, and then I had to be in the US. Otherwise, I would have been in Tasmania. But I had to be in the US, and so I started looking around for, not quite sort of the Tasmania of the US, but sort of something similar. The list is short, and very quickly, it's Oregon. It's sort of how I ended up here. So, kind of a meandering answer to your question, but it was an evolution. There wasn't a moment where, yeah, I love wine and I want to do wine. It was just this process of just slowly getting here.
So many questions about that answer. We'll come back in a second. Let's talk about life before wine a little bit. You mentioned a little bit about your upbringing. Tell me, where were you born and raised, and tell me about your education.
Sure. I was born in London, in the UK, but then we left London when I was about 3. So my father took this job in university in Singapore, and that's where I grew up, in the Nanyang University, in the university campus in Singapore. And then I finished high school in Singapore, and then went to the UK for university, and then did aeronautical engineering, did fluid mechanics, and then investment banking. Yeah.
Tell me about that, the choice of specialty. What engineering and mechanics? Why, and what was the plan with that degree? Interestingly enough, my father did social science, but literally, all my uncles did either maths or engineering. Like, it was just, I grew up just with maths and engineering. There was no options, really. I wanted to be an astronaut. So did aeronautical engineering and fluid mechanics, and it was coming out of Cambridge, where I think I just did too much of it, right? I just did too much, the academic thing. I realized there was an outside world, and just went, completely the opposite direction. If it's the opposite direction, and just went out and did investment. There's no history of that in my family. Like, nobody understood why I made a decision, but I think it was, again, trying to do something different from what I've been doing for a long, long time. Yeah. So when you made that decision to do something different, tell me about how investment banking became the thing you did, and tell me about kind of the entry into that.
It was the time of huge deregulation in the industry. So in London, New York, and I'm sure all the other financial centers, there was just this sort of wave of recruitment going through the universities, right? Just like, if you can count, you can get a job in investment banking, kind of thing. It's like, so, and they were very aggressive in recruiting, and I think that's sort of how I fell into it. So at the time, it felt like, if you have a vaguely sort of scientific or mathematical degree, you will be courted by management consultants and investment bankers. That's it, like all over the campus in all the major universities, and that's sort of how I got into it. I knew very little about it. Yeah.
So tell me about your time there. Obviously, you said you spent about a decade or so in it. Tell me, 12 years. Tell me about that time.
Most of it was spent in Europe. I was based in London, and I was doing sort of IPOs and mergers and acquisitions, and initially equity research, and then IPOs, mergers and acquisitions, and very quickly focused on the sector, which was the telecommunications sector. So working with companies in that sector, and pretty much across Europe. So I was traveling a lot in sort of Germany, Eastern Europe, France, Portugal. So there was a lot of traveling, which is great. I mean, a lot of what shaped me and my views about wine comes from that period of time of traveling around the world. And then the second part of that career, I was actually in Asia, where the final stint was in China, in Beijing, Goldman Sachs. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
What did you enjoy about the work?
That's a good question. What did I enjoy about it? The travel, definitely, right? Having the opportunity for someone to pay you to travel around the world is nice. I think
the travel, the sense that misguided as it may seem, that you are doing things as the front and center of what's going on in the world, right? There's a real kind of you feel like you're connected to the real world, and you are doing things every day that affects it. And then actually, although again, maybe people may find this hard to believe, but the professionalism of it, it's just the place I worked in, there is very kind of pragmatic, end result driven process that is very much structured on being incredibly professional and focused on detail, right? That kind of environment where the work is really intense, but everyone involved is super professional in terms of getting things done. That it didn't seem rare at the time, but now I know that's actually quite rare. That's actually quite rare. So looking back, I think that's probably one of the the bit that I miss most. Yeah.
And why was it time to leave? What made you decide to leave and do something different?
It became, goodness, you're actually the first person to ask that question. Because it seems so obvious. Nobody asked it because to everyone else, they think the answer is obvious, but actually it's not as obvious as it seems. I think it's just that if you do it long enough, the lifestyle gets to you, right? And it's, at some point, you seem to start with, the traveling was great. And then at the latter stages of it, you realize my life revolves around airports, right? And at that point, it doesn't feel right anymore. It's when all your shopping is done at airports. That's when you're sort of like, hang on, I haven't been to a shop other than Heathrow Airport. That can't be right. So I think the pace of it and the lifestyle reached a point where, unhealthy is probably the wrong word, but I felt like I should be doing something different in my life now.
So you mentioned Jancis as kind of a big part of
to start with.
You started learning wine. So tell me about that initial meeting and what you kind of came away from that thinking. Did you start to think that wine might be something you were interested in doing, or was it more of a like, oh, this is a kind of a next adventure I might take?
It's definitely the latter. So at that stage, there was definitely no idea at all how one could possibly make a living out of this. I was still in the mode of just really enjoying doing research and studying and learning more about it. And she never sort of said, okay, this is, in fact, actually, she probably said, if you're thinking about making a living out of it, don't do it, right? So actually, along the way, lots of people gave advice along the lines of, if you're thinking of making a living out of it, please don't do this, do something else, right? But she knew, almost everyone also knew that would almost inevitably fall on deaf ear. And nobody takes that advice. People just keep plowing on. But what was great talking to her was obviously her background and experience, right? Just her understanding of everything about the industry. So to be able to be a sounding board and said, okay, this is where I am now. Where do you think I can go? And what do you what paths, right? So I think the bottom line, although she may disagree, but I think the bottom line was that she was saying, give yourself more time and explore more before you make the decision, right? Because there are no, to the point that you shouldn't make a living out of this, there are no obvious path that is the right thing and the most obvious thing and the greatest thing, right? And it's an industry that's so driven by passion that it's very personal, right? Each person has its own reason why they want to pursue it, whatever the direction they want to pursue it in. And I think, so it came out of probably the biggest decision point coming out of that was, do I continue down the WSET, master wine route, or do I go to UC Davis, right? And because at the time the Linfield thing didn't exist, right? So do I go to Adelaide, Australia or California and do a more really, really technical thing, or do I continue to do the WSET thing? And we decided, partly because of my background, then maybe that's a better direction to take, and take it as far as you want, right? You can do the whole master of wine thing. And then, you know, as part of the giving myself more time thing, to do this research project with Linda Murphy in the US. Yeah.
So let's talk about that research project a little bit. Obviously, you're educated in wine at this point in kind of a textbook WSET way, and you've been a wine consumer. Tell me about what's different about going to wine country and meeting the people in it and starting to research from that perspective. What did it change about your kind of mindset about wine? What did you learn?
It's well, a lot, but in an unstructured way. So one of the again, this is before Linfield has this course, but I think one of the great things about WSET is that it provides an overall framework, right, on all aspects of wine, right? Nothing is you don't really dig deeply into any aspect of it, but it gives you the whole picture. Like, you know, the range of subject I talked about earlier on, every single part of that is addressed in WSET, even if it just touches on it. Mm-hmm. So you have this sort of framework. And then as I went through the process of traveling around the world, meeting winemakers, you start filling in pieces of it. So it's like a jigsaw thing, right? So there isn't, you know, I didn't meet this person and they answered the question on everything in wine. No, it was like, this person I learned this, and that person I learned that, you know, like, probably an example of that is, although it's not part of that project, but when I went to Burgundy, I had a chance to meet Mounier, Jacques-Frédéric Mounier, and we talked about sort of organic viticulture biodynamics. It seems obvious after he said it, but at the time it was like a light bulb moment, right? And it was basically saying, he said the problem with organic farming is that people kind of don't understand what the issue is. It's about how toxic a spray is, right? Not whether it's organic or not. And so the problem with the organic movement is that the label organic means more now than the thing that you are spraying. And it is not a given that anything which is, you know, synthetic, man-made is by definition worse than something which isn't, right? On a case-by-case basis, you have to address the issue, what is toxic and what isn't. And how toxic, what is the exact chemical issue that you're dealing with? And his problem is that has gone out of the window, right? And there was an example of some pest or disease in France where the organic solution to that is a lot worse to the people working in the vineyard than the synthetic, you know, solution. But then because they have to be organic certified, they have to use that, right? So he has huge issue with that. You know, that, and again, obvious, right? But at the time, if you are just a consumer or learning about wine, you know, you have the labels, biodynamic, organic, conventional, and you discuss why that is bad, why this is good. Well, it's more subtle than that, right? You have to think about it more accurately and more precisely. So there are lots of moments like that, and that stayed with me because that completely transformed the way I think about, you know, farming and why this place looks like this place now. And I think, you know, talking to Paul Draper about, you know, America's role in winemaking, about how to make a world-class wine, being true to America without just sort of thinking about always trying to be France kind of thing, right? And how he achieved it. You know, that is very inspiring for someone who is going to do something not in France but in America. And there are just sort of endless examples of that, down to, you know, choice of barrels and, you know, choice of pruning shears and choice of just every little sort of nuance involved in the process. Each person, I would have learned something from them, and then, you know, you have this sort of jigsaw, and just the pieces just sort of start sort of filling in.
So you mentioned all the places. So you mentioned Bordeaux and Burgundy and Australia and Tasmania, and then of course coming to the U.S. and seeing some of the wine regions here. Tell me, as you were traveling, what were some of the biggest differences between the places, and what were the things you saw that you thought, you know, when I do this, I want to make sure this is part of my project, or, you know, if I ever do this, this is gonna be something I definitely do or definitely don't want to do.
One of the biggest, I think the biggest difference, and the most obvious one, is in places like Bordeaux, and actually,
Well, in places like Bordeaux, definitely in Burgundy, the wine culture is deep, right? Centuries old. Although, and that in itself means people carry themselves through the industry in a different way. The weight of history is something that's both helpful, obviously, but may be a barrier, right? But you see new generations of Burgundian winemakers who go and work in New Zealand and Australia precisely because they need to sort of break away from just my great grandfather did this, so I'm going to do it, right? And I think that's the biggest difference. Whereas if you're in Australia and New Zealand, you're already in Australia and New Zealand, right? You don't have that weight of legacy. And then you have the opposite problem saying, hang on, the Burgundians know what they're doing. Let's go there and find out what they know. So I think travel has made places, the differences become less so because the younger generation are traveling in both directions. But before that, I think the legacy of what Burgundy and Bordeaux and Champagne is has an impact on everyday life in a way that not quite in California and definitely not in Oregon, right? I mean, you can do whatever you want, right? And there is no kind of my great-grandfather did this. There is no great-grandfather who did this, Is there great-grandfather? No, right? Even Jason Lett is second generation, right? They may be a third generation now. So my grandfather did this, right? But there's no my great-grandfather did this. And so I think that's the biggest difference. I don't think there are any sort of specific things like, I shouldn't use this brand of, thing, or I shouldn't use that tractor or something. I don't think there's anything very specific. It's just the overall environment. When you go to Burgundy, you feel it. You feel how important wine is to the whole place in a way that I don't think you feel anywhere else that I've been to, right? Or in Champagne as well. Yeah, you feel the weight of the industry. But, you don't do that anywhere else. I think that's the biggest difference I can think of. There's great wine everywhere. There are great winemakers everywhere. There's bad wine everywhere, right? And I really do think sort of the modern world of traveling and people traveling around has sort of evened things out a lot more than people think. Yeah.
So I want to come back to something you said in your first answer when you're talking about the travels you made. You mentioned Tasmania as kind of the place. So what was it about Tasmania that versus all these other wine regions, these more established and more kind of dignified perhaps wine regions? What was it about Tasmania that stood out to you, and as you were traveling through?
There was a sense. There's definitely a sense of still being frontier, right? I mean, even southern Australia is very established. I mean, they have 100-year-old vines, and their families. Second, third generation families now, doing it. And you go to Tasmania, it helps that it is a stunningly beautiful place. It helps that, the coastline is spectacular. In a way, the Oregon coastline is a big part of why I'm here. But there's the frontier spirit, but there's also a singular focus on making good wine, right? That because you're sort of out there, there isn't the obvious answer of let's do this because this is now I'm treading very dangerous ground when I'm in Oregon. Let's not do it because of wine tourism, right? Let's do it because we want to make like really nice, really good wine. So as a community, they had no choice. Not a lot of people fly to Tasmania for wine tourism. So if you're doing it, you're doing it because you want to make good wine. It's the only way you're going to make this work. That you have nothing else to offer, right? Not because the scenery isn't amazing, just that you are very, very far away. And that is the focus of that was was really refreshing. And all the other major wine regions have obviously have this sort of history of making amazing wine, but there's a lot of other layers, social layers around it. Whereas in Tasmania, there just isn't. It's just like, you're in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to make some great wine, right? And that was, the simplicity and focus of that was very attractive. Yeah.
Definitely does sound a little familiar.
Yeah, yes.
So you mentioned your trip to the United States and visiting a lot of wine regions, but not Oregon. So tell me at what point you became aware of Oregon as a wine region and of the wines here.
And so I
I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I went to a restaurant, and on the list was a bottle of EIEIO Pinot Noir, J. McDonald, right? I've never tasted Oregon wine before, and that was the very first time, and I tasted it and I went, oh my goodness, this is amazing, right? And that was it, I kid you not, that is the moment. I mean, I did my studies, I read about Oregon, but Oregon is one of many places in the world. There's no obvious link to it. I know about Pinot Noir, etc. But it was tasting that wine and how amazing that was that made me went like, hang on, I need to know more about this place, right? And then I started reading more about it, and then I got on a plane, and then I flew here. I still remember the very first time I was here with my wife. We've never been here, and the only thing we heard of was Dundee Hills, right? And so, where should we stay? I went, Dundee, okay. I still remember sort of renting the car, drove here, and we went, I'm sorry, is this it? This is basically Red Hills Market. That's it. That is Dundee. I was like, okay, this is not what this is coming from California, coming from Bordeaux, coming from Burgundy, and this is like the hub, the center of the Oregon wine industry, right? And we turned on Red Hills Market and looked around and went, okay, this is it. This is the Oregon wine industry, right? So that's how little I knew about it. And then obviously I stayed here and started traveling and tried to learn more. But if you think about it, that was probably in 2011, 2012. I mean, if you think about how much the place has grown since 2012, right, in the last 10 years. I mean, even then it was small and intimate, right? I'm sure, people like Jason and I would say, no, it's already a monster by that stage, but compared to today, it's still quite small and intimate, yeah.
So that's a pretty wonderful first impression of Oregon wine. I'm curious, as you started to travel here, what were your impressions of the wines here, of the place, and of the people as you started to kind of make an acquaintance with Oregon?
Well, first of all, as you will find out later on, I'm not a naturally sort of sociable person. But strangely enough, the first person I tried to get in touch with was J. McDonald, right? Because that was the very first Oregon wine. And then that is a sort of starting point. There's sort of like a social circle around that I began to sort of slowly spend time with and meet. Mm-hmm. And there was definitely a sense of a very small and close-knit community, which is still true today, I think. But then it's sort of a natural function of, if I don't stray away from that, it feels like that is the world, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure it's not. I mean, there must be hundreds and thousands of people involved now, but there is that sort of frontier spirit. Exactly what I'm talking about in Tasmania, right? It's like there's a group of people sort of like, in the middle of nowhere kind of thing, right? And the only option you have is to make good wine, because there was nothing else that you were trying to do, mm-hmm, right? And I definitely felt that. I felt that that was a very strong sense of that's what this place is about, because mm-hmm, that's the only thing that's going on. It's changed a lot since then, but back then definitely that's what it felt like. Yeah.
So you mentioned that it was Jay's wine, EIEIO, that got you started. As you tasted Oregon wines, did you find that his wine was representative of what you were tasting, or was it an outlier?
No, it wasn't an outlier. It wasn't an outlier. I mean, it's not as if it's not that. It's not an outlier in the sense that I'm not even sure there is. I'm not even sure if there is a obvious, if there's an obvious thing called Oregon wine anymore, right? I think Oregon now produces a broad range of styles. So his is one style in the spectrum, and there are others who are the same part of the spectrum, but I'm absolutely certain that there's now, the same thing as Chardonnay, right? If you want to, is there such a thing as Oregon Chardonnay? Absolutely not. I mean, I literally did this with Jancis. We did a horizontal tasting of 2014, and the message coming out of that was like, there is no one thing here, right? There's the range of
of styles is so big that you can't actually say, that's Oregon. Right? And I think Jay's is, on that part of a spectrum, and there are others similar to him, but then there are others sort of on either side of it. Yeah.
So how does this project become something you want to do? You've come to Oregon, you've met some people, you've had some wines, you've seen Dundee. Tell me about how this becomes the next step, and why this spot in particular.
You're looking at the reason why. You're looking at the reason why this spot. It's accident, really. It's not as if I had a lot of choices. I spent, I don't know, a year maybe looking around, just sort of traveling around and driving around. I don't know what it is today, but back then it wasn't as if there were hundreds of property for sale. I mean, you really have to just do the legwork and travel, and it was just true sheer luck that this came along. I already narrowed it down to a couple of variables. First of all, I was looking for altitude, so I wanted something higher. And one of the talks with one of the winemakers, the idea of an east-facing slope resonated with me, because it catches the morning sun and it reduces the Z pressure, and et cetera, et cetera. So the slope behind us, the east-facing slope, the altitude. So if you take that two variables, suddenly you're not down to many properties that you can look for. And it was just true. The soil type was a factor, but not as big of a factor. I think it's debatable if you can say if there is the right soil type. Clearly, the fact that it's loam, it's jewelry, is a very good thing. I like the idea of that. And so, jewelry soil, altitude, east-facing slope, what's available, right? And this property popped out, and there was an opportunity to buy it, and so I did. Probably a lot bigger than I originally was thinking of getting, but yeah, so that's how I ended up here.
So describe the property for me as you first see it, before you've done anything to it. What was here before, and how big was it, and what was your sort of vision for it, what it could become?
So we're sitting, so the whole property is 80 acres. And we're sitting in the top 40. So it's divided into two bits. Just around the corner there's a fence line. And below that, so where all the white oaks are, that's the bottom 40 acres. So we're in the sort of top 40 acres. And when I got here, all the walnut trees are here. And then everything else was blackberries. Like literally, apart from this sort of dirt road that we sort of walked down, if you look left and right, all you saw was like 10-foot high blackberry bushes, right? The whole place was covered. And so the very first thing, apart from fencing, that I did was basically just trying to carve out areas of land, which is, to remove the blackberries. But it was all done mechanically. So from the very first day, I was very determined to not use any chemicals at all, which some would say it was insanity, but I've managed to carve out areas of land, but it needs work to make it continue to look like this. Unkept as it is, it's an insane amount of work to fight back the blackberries. And I actually grew quite fond of them, which is why I actually keep them actually. And we pick them, and they're just the most amazing fruit. So I was very focused on the east-facing slope for the vines. I had no plans for the rest of the property at all. I just sort of thought, just let it be, right? And as part of the sort of the ecosystem here, it gave me scope to sort of just create a vineyard that's sort of lost in the wild, as it were, and to be able to surround it with an ecosystem was nice. It wasn't the plan, it was just so because I had this property and I was focused on the east-facing slope, and the rest of it I just sort of let it be. I couldn't let it be completely wild, otherwise everything would be blackberries, and which is why I then had sort of goats and llama and sort of carved out areas where they roam. So the bit behind us used to be
all of it was like that, like those blackberries over there. Like literally every single inch of this was. And the only reason why it looks like this now is the goats. So over the years, they're there for about 9 months of the year. I've moved them now. They're in another part of the land for the summer, but during the winter, spring, and parts of the autumn, they're here. And they've actually been responsible for, fighting back the blackberries. So I've done, like, for that part of the land and that part of the land, I haven't touched it with any equipment, right? It was just all goats and llama. Here, yes, I actually have a mower to sort of go around to push back the blackberries. In terms of the future, I'm just very focused on what I have now. I think it would take literally my lifetime to just focus on that. And if the next generation feels like doing other things with the property, they're more than welcome to, but I have no plans, yeah.
So tell me about installing the vineyard then. You mentioned kind of in the wild, vineyard in the wild. Tell me about what's the philosophy behind the way you did the vineyard, and what did you plant, and how did you choose what to plant?
I think as I was, one of the reasons I actually ended up doing this is I was mentioned earlier on, was sort of a communing with nature thing. And it was, as I was doing research on sort of organics and biodynamics, my wife bought me a copy of Fukuoka's book, One Straw Revolution. And if there was an epiphany moment in this whole process, that was it. Right? That was the one where I went, oh yeah, so there's a different way of thinking about this. And I didn't realize people were thinking like that, the way that he was thinking. And from that point onwards, sort of all the decisions became centered on exploring how that could work. And so, yeah, so everything that you sort of see around here comes from the idea of seeing whether that could work or not. Yeah.
So for those not familiar, take me through a little bit of
sure. What is different about that? I think the biggest difference is that you have to rethink. You have to rethink what viticulture is. Okay, it is not the way I understand it and the way I read it is. If you think about conventional viticulture, if you think about organic, if you think about biodynamics, they are actually all the same. What's different is that you're spraying different things. Right? The fundamental philosophy is I have a plot of land and I'm going to cultivate it. And what do I cultivate it with? Right? And what are the tools that I can use to cultivate it? Right? The Fukuoka philosophy turns it on its head slightly by saying, what if you do nothing? What would happen? Right? And that if you have that starting point, it changes everything. Because it's not, so a lot of people come to me and say, instead of spraying this, what will Fukuoka spray? Well, no, that's not the point. You always have to go back to the starting question, which is, what if you did nothing? Right? What will happen? Right? And then you start to feel, and through observation, you start to get an understanding of what would naturally occur. And then from that, you start to devise a way of living with the land that maximizes what would occur naturally, right? Therefore minimizes what you have to do, and you end up with something that is more in line of what nature would want to give you. And not that inevitably will lead to a better wine. That's not the point, right? Neither is that will lead to higher yield, which it may do, but that's again not the point, right? The point is, if you focus on what would naturally happen, you get a product which is, again, that's still not the point. Not that you get a product more natural, but it's a way of life, right? That you are more in tune with nature, and I think that's sort of the underlying philosophy of it. And the critics of that would say, well, that's hardly useful, is it? Right? You know, I have debt, I have land, I have a yield number that I have to hit, right?
the counter to that would be, well, first of all, I am not a proponent of it. I'm not on the crusade to think that everybody should do it. I do it because I like it, right? And I'm under no illusion this could be insanity. I'm under no illusion that the numbers will never work out, right? But it might, right? But again, that's not the point. The point is if it does, it's amazing. Like I have vines, actually the vines that you just saw have had no spray this year. None, zero, right? My land is not tilled, right? No tilling, no spraying. All they had was sun and water. And I have grapes, right? Again, the critics will say, well, what is your yield? Yes, it's shockingly low. I understand that, right? But think about it. I did nothing to get shockingly low yield. My yield return on effort put in is insanely high, right? So there are lots of, and there's literally more, like there are vines, the vines over there had some weed whacking done, right? That's all I did. The vines over here have had nothing done at all, not even weed whacking, right? This section here, since the beginning of the year, the only thing I did was prune. So after March pruning, I have not been back in that part of the vineyard, right? I'm just gonna let it just do its own thing. And if you go in there now, you see vines, green leaves, fruit, right? And I've done nothing to it, okay? So that process of, and you have to rethink the whole thing of saying, like, if you have a yield number you're trying to hit, never do this. Or do it in the 20th year when you begin to understand what this land will give you, then I will be able to predict yield. In fact, I can tell you what the yield is year by year while I, don't do anything to the land, right? But it will take that kind of time, right? And it would take sort of, I don't know, 10, 20 years or something before this thing settles into its own kind of rhythm. And it may be the yield is so shockingly low that it doesn't make any sense, or maybe not, right? What is the right, if you don't have to till or spray, what is the right yield number, right? That is a question that nobody ever asks because that's insanity, right? People say, you have a business plan, I need this amount of grapes so that I can make this amount of wine, so that I can, So if you tell me that you can't even answer the first question, how much grapes you're going to, then this method is completely meaningless, right? But that's also because nobody does it. If there was a history of, lots of people doing it, people will be able to tell you what the yield is. Because as a region, Oregon, we all do this. And in 100 years, we will be able to tell for this plot of land, right? If you still have to clear the blackberries, that's the one part Fukuoka can't deal with. Or maybe you can, I don't know, I haven't found the answer yet. And, you will be able to sort of predict it, right? But if nobody does it, then of course nobody knows the answer, right? Again, I'm not an advocate at all, because I completely understand the need for people to make a living, right? You can't tell the Oregon wine industry to just put everything on hold for 100 years, right? But if more and more people try it and do it, and we start accumulating knowledge about this, maybe. And if nobody wants to do it, that's perfectly fine with me, right? Because I really, the sense of, and it's incredibly personal, but the sense of achievement of seeing a vine, that you planted grow up and survive through all the sort of weather changes that we've seen, to be healthy, green leaves, producing fruit, where I have literally not touched it at all. That sense of that vine being so in tune with nature, it's amazing. It really is. It means so now when I go to a vineyard, when I see it's like, acres and acres of this perfectly sort of manicured vineyard, which I completely understand why it's necessary, doesn't really leave me with much. I don't feel that, wow, that's amazing. It's striking. The first image is striking, but then afterwards I sort of go, all I can see is the tractors, right? All I can see is the work that's been done to it. Whereas, if you take me, there's a guy on social media, there's an English winemaker who travels around and he's doing this project in Bolivia. And they have these sort of 200-year-old vines that are literally climbing up trees. And that's how they make wine. They literally climb up the tree to harvest from vines. That to me, that was like, oh my God, that is the most amazing vineyard I have ever seen, right? So it's not, Montrachet or DRC. That is it. For me, that is the sort of the essence of what's possible. And so that very much drives what I'm trying sort of to do here. So just let things develop as much as possible naturally. I have to react to things. I mean, last year powdery mildew was crazy. This year's not. Last year was absolutely crazy. And if I really did do nothing, everything would be covered in powdery mildew. Right? Again, not sure what Fukuoka answer the powdery mildew is. But his counter argument was that if that happens every year, then you should be planting grapes anyway. And then also, what if it doesn't happen every year? There are years where you will lose everything. You lose everything, right? You have to sort of ride through that, right? But it's nature. People who did everything last year still lost everything too, right? And it maybe if you don't do anything and lose everything, it's better than doing everything and lose everything. So it's a real kind of it's a philosophical thing rather than, this is, you should teach it at college because this is the best thing to make wine and have a wine industry. It could be, but nobody's, there isn't enough. It just takes too long, I think. But there are also elements of it that you can adopt, right? As a philosophy, you can push it as far as you want to in terms of doing nothing, or you can always just take a step back and just relax a bit and just let things develop a little bit, right? Clearly, debt does not help. Clearly, if you have interest payment, it does not help. But if you have the luxury of no debt, right, and you have some sort of wiggle room on it, and I'm not even sure financially, I would argue that I think you have no control over revenue, but you have a lot less costs, right? So in terms of strictly on return, if you have no debt, if you have no interest payments, strictly on return, on thinking about return, it may actually be better. I don't know, right? And I think that's something that's worth exploring if people feel like it, or not, as the case may be. I had an interview with someone literally on this topic. The whole interview was just about Fukuoka, and he came out and said, "Well, you're not really going to be an advocate for that." I was, no, absolutely not. I have no intention to be an advocate. Right, because I completely understand the need for people to make a living, and this is not the way to do it right now without accumulated experience. Right?
So tell me about, obviously, the from a philosophical perspective, you can see the benefits of this. You can see, like you mentioned, the kind of in tune with nature and watching things happen.
Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges for you? How do you decide when and how much to intervene, and what are the challenges for you as you go through a growing season?
I haven't had many growing seasons, so I think that's the first thing. Ultimately, it boils down to, does it matter? Does yield matter? Okay. If yield matters, then this literally is insanity. But if yield doesn't matter, then actually there are no challenges. So that's the sort of the philosophical thing, right? If it is okay to lose the whole crop, then what challenges can there be? Right? You just let this thing do its thing, and you experiment with, okay, if I weed whack away the blackberries, what happens? If I don't weed whack the blackberry, what happens? And the answer is, in both cases, you have grapes. Okay, but again, yield, right? That's the variable that you are trying, that you're grappling with. But if you take that off the table, then there are literally no challenges, because what are you trying to solve for? If you say, I'm trying to solve for the vines being alive, they're alive, right? Then what else are you trying to solve for? So I think once you say, okay, yield matters, then what are the boundaries, right? How high and how low can they be before it's an issue? And then within that, you kind of think about what are the challenges. I think it is one of the things I found out is it's highly, highly sensitive, right? In the sense that if you don't do anything at all, if you go walk through that vineyard, there are literally certain rows that do much better than others. Now, it could be the plant material, or it could literally be just, this thing is so sensitive that particular spot in terms of water, airflow, everything is just right. And then 2 rows away from it, it's not, right? Or it's the plant material. That set of plant material is more in tune to this land, and that isn't. I don't know the answer to that. So one or the other. So I think the real challenge is just time. If I can accelerate this process so that we have a season every week,
right, rather than every 52 weeks, then I'll have a chance to observe this and gather enough sort of experience to be better at thinking through all the issues. But I don't. So we just have to wait a year, right? And then you sort of accumulate some knowledge. And each year, as each year go by, I change slightly what I do and the sequence of it with what I do by referencing what happened the year before. But it's just going to take time. I think time. The biggest challenge by a mile is time. Is that it takes a long time to accumulate experience. There hasn't been any diseases apart from powdery mildew last year or pests that in itself killed every vine, right? Again, I'm sure you can get a long list of consultants to come here and look and this is the most horrendous vineyard I've ever seen, right? It's like, why are you doing this? Why is that? Are they, fine, right? The vines are alive, they produce grapes, right? But they want more than that, right? And so I cannot offer them more. So if you say, what is the biggest challenge is, I cannot offer more than that, right? Or maybe I can, but I haven't figured out, what. There is literally one row of vine further down the slope, which is much more vigorous than all the others, which the green is right now. If you go down now, I have not watered. It is almost surrounded by blackberries now, and it's super lush, no powdery mildew, just completely naturally on its own, and I have no idea why. Literally, I wish my whole vineyard is like that, but it isn't, right? And that fascinates me. So if I look at that vine and I said, there are no problems at all, right? The problem is I only have that row, right? If you say, can you repeat that, 8,000 times currently? No, because I don't even know why that happened, right? But if I did, then I can repeat. Then we have no problems anymore, okay? So I think the biggest challenge is time. Yeah, that this is going to take forever. It's a generational thing, which has always been. I mean, the monks took a long time to figure out, Burgundy. So it will take time.
So with that said, as you're observing year to year, what are you looking for? What are the observations you're trying to make, and what are the adjustments you make based on that?
Having taken yield off the table, bringing it back on again, right? And just seeing, and again, this is so difficult. I mean, there's so many variables involved. You can never isolate it. This is the worst scientific experiment you can do. It's just so uncontrolled. There's so many variables. I have no idea what caused what. I think for me, it's still the probably water and competition, right? Because I don't till, okay? So the impact of not tilling, the impact of how that affects, vigor and growth through the season. And I experiment with that. If there's one unnatural thing I do, I water. Which is why you see hose pipes around here. I have no irrigation system though. But I just literally hand water the vines, and I don't do it across the whole thing. So because I only do it for sections of it, I can see the difference between doing it and not doing it. And again, if you take yield off the table, doesn't matter as long as at the end of the day you get the fruit. But it may matter if yield goes down to zero. That's not exactly great, right? It has to be something. And so I think it's experimenting with that. That is practically the only thing I experiment with is water and understanding that. But that changes as the root gets deeper anyway, right? So to your point about challenges, if I had a 30-year-old vineyard here, which has been dry farmed, oh my God, this would be so easy. This would be like literally the easiest thing in the world, because you just basically take water off the table, right? So now, what else do I have to worry about? I've already solved the water problem because the root system is deep, right? And then, in terms of diseases and pests, I am not aware of any pests that has affected things in any significant way at all. Are my leaves can you take pictures and put it in a magazine, all of them? No. Some of them have little holes in them and stuff like that, but broadly speaking, they're fine, right? Yes, there are molehills everywhere. I don't mind, right? They help churn and they help sort of aerate the soil, and as long as it's on, I'm not aware of losing any vines because of them. Right, literally, yes, the ground looks uneven, right? But but in terms of the impact on the vine, I haven't seen anything. Powdery mildew, that's it. It all boils down to that one thing. That's the only thing that, and I have experimented with spraying milk, which is why you see that tank over there. And that's the only thing I have sprayed today. And I didn't even do that for all of the vineyard. I did it for sections of it. So I spray diluted milk. But I don't know whether this year seems, oh my goodness, if there's wood to touch. This year seems fine, but I don't know if it's because I sprayed milk or this year was fine anyway because of the heat earlier in the season. Some people were saying the crazy heat we have for 5 days actually dramatically reduced powdery mildew pressure, right? And then we're done. I have no other problems. I mean, it's just stopping the blackberries from taking over the whole property. Right? But that's basically it. Literally, I'm down to that one problem of stopping blackberries from taking down, everything else. And then sort of, you have to prune. That's unfortunately, I think there are people in Australia who would even stop doing that. Right? What happens if you don't even prune it? Right? The Bolivian 200-year-old vines climbing out the tree thing, right? But so you suddenly reduce it down to very, very little things that you're going to do. Grasses grow here. And if you don't mow them, they will reach a point you can't even get into the vineyard, right? So there's you have to do some element of mowing for excess. Nothing else, really. But I have very young vines, and again, if you're thinking of pruning and creating sort of structures, and what are the other problems that come with higher leaf density, but that's again a question of yield. Right? What if I don't prune for yield? I prune for reducing the sort of powdery mildew, right? And they'll say, well, then you can only get a bunch of grape vine, I'll get a bunch of grape vine, right? So all of these kind of equations, I mean, the equations change if you start fixing different variables, right? And conventional viticulture is so set in its way in terms of, what are the things that you fix, that everything else has to follow to make that work, right? Whereas if you take that off the table, then suddenly you have room to maneuver, right?
So when it came time to plant, tell me what you decided to plant and how, and if you have future plans to plant something different.
I don't have future plans to plant anything different. Okay. That's the first thing. I decided on Chardonnay. One, because I like it, and two, I went to, so when I started thinking about Oregon, it was all Pinot Noir, right? It probably still is, predominantly Pinot Noir. And so my original thoughts were Pinot Noir because of that, because I knew very little. As we've established, I knew very little about Oregon when I got here. And then it was, again, through sheer luck, it was the 2012 Chardonnay Symposium, I think. I think it must be 2012, 2013, it must be 2012. Has to be 2012. The vintage they were pouring was the 2011. And there was 6 people pouring. The room had maybe 40 people in it, if that. It was tiny, tiny thing, right? This is not IPNC. And I tasted the wine, and it was just a revelation. It was just like, wow! It just never occurred to me to even think about it, right? And it was at that point when I went like, oh no, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do the Pinot Noir thing because it's special. And my white Burgundy and Chablis, it's a big part of what I used to drink. And so suddenly having something, it would never be the same. But having something that is in that kind of zone because of the climate here, right? Suddenly was very. I just went like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So basically, it's all Chardonnay, and I have
sort of 12 clones and field selections in there. Yeah.
So you have you're drinking from your first vintage here, 2019. Tell me about that process of finally having enough grapes to make wine from, and what happened then.
The grapes are not from the vineyard.
Okay.
So a tiny amount of the grapes, and I mean tiny amount of grapes, are from this vineyard, but most of it is from Lingua Franca. So I decided that instead of waiting for another 20 years to make my first vintage, I should think about that too. And it was very fortunate to. I can't even remember how we met or how the conversation started, but Thomas at Lingua Franca, and just talked to him the possibility of making wine there, and indeed buying grapes there, right? Because I don't have enough here to do it at scale. I think this year I'll have enough if I, to just. I'm not even sure if I have enough to make a barrel, but definitely I have enough to make wine. But in terms of making, 100 cases of wine, no, I don't, right? But I wanted to kickstart that process because that, again, it's you get to do it once a year, right? So it would take me years to even, again, for this part of the process, to accumulate knowledge and experience and think about what are the variables that you want to tweak. And so that's I approached him, and he said sure. And again, Pinot Noir is such a big thing here. Chardonnay, even then, a few years ago, is still a relatively small thing. He said if I wanted to do Pinot Noir, there's no way. That place is packed with Pinot Noir. They can't do more. But if it's Chardonnay, yeah, because they split the winery into a red part of the winery and a white part of the winery. And the white part of the winery, there is still space because everybody wants to do Pinot Noir. And so that's how it started. And I started that process of learning about what barrels to buy and stuff like that. And a lot of that also came from my travels. So my choice of barrels and how much to use. Part of it's me thinking through things that I've heard. Part of it's just literally going to Burgundy and just literally asking people, what barrel did you use? Which forest did it come from? Why 350 liters and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So with that part of the process now, you're the winemaking part of the process kind of being the last thing. How involved did you want to be? Did you want to be the one doing all of the winemaking? Did you want to? How involved did you want to be in the process of actually making the wine?
Not cleaning everything, but. From the beginning, the idea was that I have to own this, right? So the team at Lingua Franca won't make key decisions for me. All right? I have to make it. I have to own it, right? Which is great. Which is exactly what I want. Clearly, all of the manual work is done by the team at Lingua Franca. But from the choice of barrels to sort of pressing cycle, to use of sulfur, to batonnage, to racking, to time spent in barrel versus time spent in stand, all of those points was my decision, and needs to be my decision because I have to own it, right? And they will. I'm sure Thomas was steering me, right? But on the other hand, you decide, right? And critically, for example, harvest, right? Your call. Do you want it now? Do you want it a week from now, right? And so I had to develop my own ideas of what are the variables I look for to make that decision, and every single part of that process. Yeah.
So what did you care about in terms of that process? What were the parts of the things that you were very much like, this is something I care deeply about in the winemaking process?
In terms of the style of wine, we are drinking it. I think there's an element. There are a couple of elements of Chardonnay that matters to me. The first one is a salinity, okay, and I like the tension of having Chardonnay, which is slightly sort of saline. I like the interplay of salinity and sort of creaminess. So the malolactic fermentation matters, but you have to balance it with enough acid and kind of, the sort of saline nature of it. So that tension matters, which all points to, I think, and I'm sure more experienced winemaker may correct me, which points to getting the pH right. Right? It's remarkable how much of winemaking centers on pH, actually. And therefore, harvesting to pH rather than harvesting to bricks matters a lot to me. And that's kind of like, that's a cornerstone of everything that I'm doing now and will do when these guys grow up. And the second part of it is oak. I think oak matters. I think oak matters in Chardonnay. I'm not convinced why there's an obsession with oak Chardonnay. I can understand why you shouldn't use too much oak, but I don't understand why you have to be zero oak. Okay? So that's another part of it which I have to sort of think through and make decisions on what's the right answer in terms of managing a barrel regime. That's kind of it, really. Everything else is just letting it happen. It's all, Wild East, and that's it. I mean, there are lots of tiny details, right? Like, when you're racking, how careful you are racking it, and obviously everything has to be very clean, and there are and sulfur. So minimal use of sulfur, but it's an important part of it. That has to be monitored, right? So it's not a dogmatic thing of like I will refuse to use sulfur, or I have to just blast it until everything is dead. So there's a pragmatic kind of, and this is the thing that the lingua franca team does so well, is the precision in which they monitor what's going on, right? And how carefully they keep monitoring what's going on. And people talk about minimal intervention sort of winemaking. You can do it blindly, or if you don't want to do it blindly, the amount of effort required to make sure things don't go wrong is huge, right? Whereas if you just blast it with sulfur, you can leave it for a year and then everything is fine. But if you don't do that, then you have to sort of stay on top of it. So I think the sulfur thing, and I had no benchmark of what is high and what is low, but when we bottled it, and I wrote my tech sheet and sort of circulated the tech sheet for this wine, and I got a response back and I thought, oh my God, you didn't use any sulfur at all. And I was like, oh my God, did I do something wrong? So why should I have used more? So that's another part of it, I think, that's sort of actively sort of managed. I can't really think of anything else, really. So you harvest it, you put it into a tank, settles overnight, rack into barrels, it turns into wine, stays in barrel for a year, goes back into the tank for another 6 months, and then it goes into a bottle. That's it.
Just that easy.
Well, no, this enormous amount of work, but if you write down the recipe, right? Yeah, that is the recipe.
I like that you mentioned people responding that way to your tech sheet, because it kind of reminds me of like parenting, where like everything you're doing, everybody else is like, I can't believe you're doing that. How did you do that? And you're like, am I doing it wrong?
I'm like, exactly. Like, I'm sorry. Should I use more? Because I have no idea. I have no benchmark, right? It's like, I'm sorry. What? Should I use more?
So now that you have wine, tell me about the next part of the process of coming up with a label and a name and of actually selling the wine.
The label is not very imaginative at all. I mean, that's my family name. So Niew is my family name. Obviously, the Chinese character is Rao. This is the calligraphy is my father, so he wrote this.
That's awesome.
And so this is it. So he wrote this. Literally translates to Niew Vineyard. So this is the Niew family, estate garden, basically. So this is Niew Vineyard. That's it. And there's two seals here. This is the Chinese. One is the family name, and then the other one is the character for quiet, Jing, which the simplest translation is quiet, but it has
ideas of meditation and introspection and the whole sort of Buddhist thing associated with that, and that is very much part of it's a family ethos things, but it's also part of the whole thing that I'm trying to do. So that's the two seal, and that's the label.
And what about selling it?
I made about 100 cases, roughly, slightly more than that. So actually it's 1,322 bottles, and so it's not a big volume to deal with. In the US, there are a group of people that have followed me through this process, and they just basically bought it from me directly. It's available at E&R. That's the only shop that has it, and they sell it. And then a decent chunk of it's gone to Singapore, which is where my father lives, and where, obviously I know people there. A chunk of it is on its way to Japan. And apart from that, and that's it, that's the whole lot. So I've sold out, right? So the Japan bit is still on a container ship, but the Singapore bit sold out, the US bit is sold out. I don't have, it's true word of mouth. And the team at E&R got in touch with me, probably because of the Fukuoka thing, and they came and they did this, they tasted and decided to take it. And then literally almost everyone else has just been following me on social media who or know me personally. And I literally have no marketing plan. Like literally it's just sort of which I think is perfectly fine if you have the sort of the volumes that I'm producing, right? So
The Friends and Family Wine Club.
The Friends and Family Wine Club. Yeah.
I'm curious about first of all, kind of your feelings about putting a wine out there with your name on the label, and about the reactions you've gotten to the wine so far.
Nerve-wracking, as I said. I mean, it truly is one of the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done. I have never been. I have not done anything like this before in terms of putting myself and the name and the label out there for essentially for people to judge, right, and to get feedback. So it's definitely nerve-wracking, but now that it's the first step has happened, and I remember sort of telling my wife that it's crucially important that we have to remember for every negative comment, hopefully there's 2 positive one, right? So don't focus on the negative. Don't throw in the towel because we had 1 negative comment. So far, I have only heard of the positive comments. So clear, and I'm 100% certain there are lots of negative ones, but they have not told me. So I'm surrounded by just waves of positive comment, which is great. But unconsciously, I know that doesn't account for everybody, right? So it's good that people have kept criticism to themselves, but just have responded very positively to it, so which is nice. Yeah. I think it's actually I don't know why. I actually don't know why. I don't know why people. I mean, I like that people like it. I like it, right? And I like that people like it, but I can't really put my finger on why it's been so well received.
You mentioned earlier, you kind of brought up 2020 as you were talking about, you can do everything right and still lose everything in a year. So let's talk a little bit about 2020 and about kind of the twin impacts of 2020. First, let's talk about COVID and last spring. So tell me about, on a kind of personal, professional level, as COVID hits and the shutdown begins last spring, what were the changes you had to make to your work and to your life, and what did you kind of do throughout the year to kind of deal with that?
Right. COVID has had very little impact on me. Primarily, as you can see, I work alone in the middle of nowhere. So, and crucially, I think for people, even for people who were working with crews, obviously there were issues of social distancing. But broadly speaking, if you're out on the winery, out in a vineyard, you're working outdoor and in space, right? So I think the impact is sort of slightly less.
In the winery, definitely during harvest, there were more kind of protocol issues and stuff like that. But that was completely blown away by the smoke, right? So I think COVID, from a practical winemaking perspective, has had relatively little, definitely no impact on me, but I suspect relatively little impact on the industry. The really big thing is the disappearance of the restaurant trade, right? So if for people who have a decent chunk of the business going to the restaurant, I'm sure and that was bad. But for people who didn't have that, I heard stories of how actually they did fine, actually, if not great, because people were drinking at home. Right? So that the really big impact is not on a personal front. Obviously, the impact of COVID was huge in terms of kids not being able to go to school, but not on the winemaking front. The really big impact was the smoke. We were, I think, 3 or 4 days away from harvest, right? And then it happened, and it's all gone, right? So to get that close, right? If it was all gone halfway through the year, or if it was all gone in the spring because of frost, for the rest of the year, you're not thinking about it anymore, right? But to get to the point of being 4 days away from harvest, and then see, I mean, literally, I was here, and you could see the smoke coming from over. You could see it literally, it's like in the movies, just coming from over the, from the range, slowly coming towards the end. The sky was orange. It was astonishing, and yeah, that was something else. And I think, and then it was all gone. And people, we were scrambling to save. I actually made wine, so because we had a decision to make. So, do I just say it's all gone, or do we still make it, right? And see what we can do with it. So I did. So we did make it. So I did do. I made a 2020 vintage, but the impact of the smoke is so obvious that I can't bottle that.
Even on Chardonnay.
Yeah, even on Chardonnay. And you cannot generalize across all the vineyards, but definitely for the grapes that I was using, it was obvious enough that I can bottle it. And I'm 100% sure there are others that are perfectly fine. So it's on a vineyard by vineyard basis, you have to sort of figure it out. Yeah.
So we talked earlier about your first impressions of Oregon's wine industry, and I'm curious, and you kind of alluded to some changes you've seen. So tell me about the changes you've seen in the last decade. What's different about Oregon wine, and as we're starting to come out of the pandemic, what do you see happening in the next few years in the industry?
I may be one of the worst person to answer the question because I spent so little time in the industry. So in what also happened in the last 5 years is I now have two sons, two kids. So one is sort of 2.5. So I have disappeared from the industry. So yeah, I spent relatively little time. So for the last 5 years, I've spent relatively little time talking to people. But I'm aware of what goes on through social media. I mean, I can see people's social media stream. Right? I don't know and I have no numbers. I mean, you will be in a much better position than me with numbers and being able to segment the industry into sort of different segments and what is the relative scale of this. But it seems to me that there's now three different parts of the industry, right? I think there now exists a volume part of the industries, not exactly Gallo, but actually, are they here? They are there. No, they're not. Jackson, right? Yeah. But definitely a volume part with everything to do with that. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I worked in Australia, and for people who do that well and do that sincerely, it's a very difficult thing to do, right? And if you can do it well and do it sincerely, all good, right? But you need to do it sincerely, right? And so I think that's part of Oregon now that probably when I started really wasn't. I mean, was it King Estate was probably the biggest thing, but then there was very few other of that scale, but I think there's more of that now. And then there is another part of the industry which I think still exists. It's sort of where I am, which is sort of like really small producer,
not really knowing what to do with marketing, but just really focus on making wine kind of people, right? And then there's another part which I think is much bigger now than it was when I started, which is much more focused on marketing, wine tourism, and pushing that part of the business forward. And I that is much more prominent, bizarrely enough, on social media, because that's the whole point, right? And I think that's new. That's definitely new. I don't mean it's in a bad way, but it's sort of the Napafication of it, right? And you hear stories coming out of California of how they have evolved, in that process, and Oregon is also evolving and thinking of new things to do. So I think that's, for me, that's the biggest part. The difference is that is now much more prominent than it used to be. Not least because every now and again a helicopter will fly, right? So I never used to have that. Yeah.
So what about as you look ahead? What will that continue, or what changes do you see, or maybe are hoping for?
I don't think I can hope for anything. I think maybe that I will be more engaged in the industry. Maybe is what I hope I'll be able to do when the kids grow up. But I think it's nice to have all of these different segments now. The danger is if one segment becomes so dominant that the others don't exist anymore. Right. I think that's a worry rather than a hope of what will happen. So if there's hope, is that all of these different spectrum of activity continues, and that there's room for everybody to do all of that. So that would be it. That there's one, and obviously of the three segments that I talked about, the most vulnerable was the third one of the people, the small producer who, how are we going to, sell wine when the consumer expect, tasting events, and I don't offer that, right? So that is the worry rather than anything else. But there's a part of me that's kind of think, as long as the volumes are small enough, there will always be a market out there for a carefully produced bottle of wine. I hope. If not, then I don't know. Well, I'm not sure what the next step is. But as long as there is that, and I think there is. And Oregon is the kind of place that there's still frontier element to it, right? I mean, Dundee is now not frontier anymore. It's like absolutely, establishment. And then but then if you go down to sort of McMinnville, and then you start going to sort of Venduza corridor, and they are still. Once you get out there, people that still, you have no option but to focus on make wine, because not many tourists go there anymore, right? So I think there will always be people who are here, which is who devote sort of 80% of their time to sort of thinking about that, and others with different teams focus on different, different thing, and I think that's going to continue. I hope so, because I'm part of that, right? I don't have any. One of the things that Oregon has always grappled with, and I'm not sure what the answer is yet, is this concept of brand Oregon, right? And this is a very young region, and in the next 50 years, as these sort of three parts of the industries continue to evolve, what is brand Oregon, right? And there is an element of worry about it, in the sense of I think the Australians, especially Australians in America, went off with brand Australia in a certain direction that now makes it really difficult for other parts of Australia to sell in America, right? Because Australia must be yellowtail kind of thing. Where it isn't. And there's some astonishing wines made by small producers and big producers in Australia, but it's really difficult because that was so powerful. And then I think similarly in Oregon, one has to be wary going forward of making sure that the story is diverse enough to reflect how diverse this place is, and not let one thing become sort of like the dominant story. Right? That's really dangerous. In the way that even
Pinot Noir is dangerous, right? You can't. Oregon is not just Pinot Noir. Far from it. In fact, Oregon is so much more, potentially so much more than Pinot Noir. If you take the whole of Oregon from north to south, right, it's literally France. Right? Literally anything that happens in France can happen in Oregon. Not Burgundy, the whole of France, right? And to tell that story and develop in that way, I think would be nice. But I mean, just a personal opinion. I have no scale or in any way, shape, or form be able to affect that. But that would be nice, rather than focus on a single idea or a single thing, which is really dangerous because you have no idea where that is going to go, and it can go in the wrong way.
So we've talked a little bit about the future here already, but I'm curious, as you look ahead for yourself in the project here, you mentioned long-term generational project. Are there things on the horizon that you're looking forward to? Are there milestones coming up for you here with this project? What's the next kind of thing you're looking forward to?
The first vintage where it's all grapes from here. That's it. So every year now, I have more grapes from here that goes into this blend. At some point, right now it still says Eola Amity. At some points I can't say that anymore. I have to say Willamette Valley. Mm-hmm. That would be a big day, right? So, and then from that point onwards, the day when I actually say, Chehala Mountains, then that is a really big day. That's when all the fruit sort of comes from here. I don't know when. I mean, people keep asking, like literally the whole point of the exercise is I don't know when, right? And I don't know, this year, still, it will still say Eola Amity, so it hasn't reached that sort of tipping point. But as each year go by, more and more will be, and then the day will come when it's all here. So that's the goal. Yeah.
That seems like that would be hard to be patient. How do you handle that?
No choice. I think one, having children. So there is this is now a part of my life. There's another part, right? That takes So I think having children definitely helps. There's no choice part of it. This is wine, right? And if this is an issue, then don't begin wine because you have no choice. This is it. Okay. Granted, you can speed this up if you don't do what I'm doing. Right, but if that's your choice, fine. But if you're really interested in doing it this way, you have no choice. So I think that's how I kind of handle it. Plus, back to right at the beginning about sort of thinking of this in a sort of more academic way. As you go, the process itself is fascinating, right? So it's not a question of being patient and nothing is happening. It's only patient in that I cannot produce a bottle. Actually, I can produce a bottle, but I can't produce 100 cases with the grapes tomorrow. Mm-hmm. But along the way, there are endless things to think about, right? And there are endless things to observe and to think about. So at no point am I bored or run out of things to do, right? So I am constantly engaged. There are constantly lots of things to do. The only thing that is not happening immediately is having 4 tons of grape next year. That's not going to happen, or next year actually. That we have to wait. Everything else is, in fact, it's almost the other way around. I wish there were weeks when nothing was going on. It's like there's nothing that I have to worry about or think about or do. I achieve about a third of what I plan to do every year. It's like there is an enormous amount of stuff that needs to be worked through. Not least because I'm doing this for the very first time. I'm first generation. There's no legacy thing that I can lean on to help steer the direction. It's literally a blank piece of paper. Right.
On that note, I'm curious what your family thinks of your endeavor.
Yes. Goodness, this is on camera, isn't it?
It doesn't have to be.
Right. I think the patient question definitely applies to them. Right. And in a very serious way. So it's like because 99% of what I think they're not aware of. Right? Because
because it's a really personal thing dealing with this, dealing with that, and so in terms of communication, they don't see so much of it. They see me sort of disappearing, right? And rather than being able to understand the nuance of everything that I'm grappling with, whereas and you know there is no sort of like a monthly result, right? So obviously when this arrived and the activity around selling this and the response from the market, that was good. That basically was a milestone that everybody could see and everybody could understand. And then we've disappeared again, right? It's like now there's going to be a period as the sort of response to this sort of dies down before the next vintage comes into the market. You could sort of dispute it. But obviously they've been supportive, otherwise I won't be able to do this, right? And that's sort of from that's my wife. Part of it is that, and then sort of my extended family. They're just they're used to doing things. I mean, like I said, I come from an academic family. Going into investment banking is even more of a stretch than this, right? What? I mean, nobody in my family understands that part of the world, so they're used to me just sort of doing different things, and have been very supportive. Really, it helps. It helps that this first vintage went well. Mm-hmm. Clearly, you know, if I had 100 cases of wine still in the warehouse, then and this is going to be difficult. I think the fact that this is broadly speaking very well received, I think it's good.
Right. That's all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here today that you'd like to cover?
Nothing I can think of.
Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Fantastic interview.
Thank you for your time.
And fantastic refreshments with our interview and a fantastic view. And we really appreciate your time, your stories.
More than welcome. More than welcome.
We'll let you off the hook. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome.